They went to the market just like every other Thursday, but this time they never came home. For 3 weeks, their family searched every mile of road, every wooded edge, every barn, and every cornfield between the house and town. Flyers were quietly handed out by neighbors, but no note was left, no sign of a struggle, and no clue as to where the girls had gone. Then, 6 months later, their horse returned, malnourished, injured, and alone. What was tangled in its reins changed everything. It was March 2nd, just after sunrise, when the Yoder sisters left their family farmhouse with a wagon full of vegetables. Grace, the elder at 16, always held the reins, while Elsie, barely 13, sat beside her with a cloth bundle of preserves in her lap. Their parents, Ruth and Samuel Yoder, watched them roll away down the gravel lane with quiet confidence. It was their third trip alone to the Thursday market, and the road to town was as familiar as their own front porch. Neighbors waved as the buggy passed by. The sisters stopped briefly at the corner well to chat with old Mr. Stoltzfus, who later recalled that Grace had asked him if the honey stand would be open that day. Everything about the morning was ordinary, peaceful. They reached the town square by 9:30 a.m. Several market vendors remembered the sisters well, especially Elsie, who offered her preserves to an elderly woman who couldn't afford them. That kind of kindness stuck with people. At 10:45 a.m., someone saw them leaving the store near the mill, cloth bags in hand, talking quietly with one another as they climbed back onto their buggy. And then nothing. By 2 p.m., Ruth grew uneasy. The girls should have been back before noon, but perhaps they stayed longer to help load something. Or maybe the horse needed rest. She told herself not to worry, but by sunset, her hands were shaking. By midnight, every lantern in the Yoder house was lit. Jacob, Grace, and Elsie's older brother rode out alone on horseback, tracing the market road in the dark, with only moonlight and God as his guide. He returned before dawn with nothing to show but silence. When the sheriff joined the search the next day, there was still hope. Search parties formed, volunteers, neighbors, deputies. For nearly 2 weeks, they combed fields, creeks, and dusty trails between the Yoder farm and the market. They found nothing: no overturned wagon, no hoofprints off the trail, no dropped handkerchief, no broken basket. On the 18th day, the official search was called off. A church service was held. Ruth refused to wear black. Spring passed, then summer. The fields bloomed, then browned. Every day, Ruth watched the front path for the sound of hooves. Every creak of the windmill made her heart stutter. Jacob left home for weeks at a time, searching on his own, returning thinner and quieter each time. Then, on October 14th, just before dawn, the family's buggy horse appeared outside their gate. The same horse, same harness, but its ribs showed. Its flanks were cut, its hooves cracked and bleeding. The reins dragged along the ground like torn thread. Entangled in the leather, tightly knotted, was something pale and fluttering. A piece of cloth. Checkered blue and white Elsie's bonnet ribbon. Ruth fell to her knees before the gate. The horse stood still, shaking. Whatever had happened to her daughters wasn't over. Ruth didn't speak for hours after the horse returned. She sat beside the animal in the dirt, her hand resting lightly on its flank, whispering prayers that made no sound. Samuel tried to bring her inside, but her legs wouldn't move. It was Jacob who finally fetched a wet cloth and gently wiped the blood-crusted fur from the horse's neck. The veterinarian, an Englishman named Dr. Hastings, who had tended the Amish livestock for years, arrived just after noon. He didn't ask many questions. Could see the family was hanging on by a thread. Instead, he knelt by the animal, examined the torn reins, the cuts along its legs, and the cracked hooves. "It's been walking for days," he said softly. "Maybe longer. Alone." Jacob asked. Dr. Hastings didn't answer at first. Then he shook his head. Whatever happened, this horse wasn't pulling anything for most of that time. The buggy would have left clear marks. There's no sign of it. Samuel's face paled. "So where's the wagon?" The vet looked at him sadly. Gone. By sunset, word had spread. In their quiet corner of Lancaster County, news moved slowly but steadily, especially something like this. The Yoder girls had vanished 6 months ago, and most had assumed the worst. Some believed they'd been taken by outsiders, others whispered about wild animals, and a few, especially among the older women, believed in something darker, more spiritual. But now, with the horse back, there was no choice but to face the truth again. The sheriff returned that evening, less formal this time. He'd aged in 6 months, his beard whiter, his posture heavier. He stood near the gate, staring at the animal as if it might speak. "I want to bring in someone from the state," he said. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" "Because," the sheriff replied, "something brought that horse back, and I don't think it was chance." The Yoders agreed reluctantly. A state investigator named Melanie Carter arrived 2 days later. She was in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense face and an understanding tone. She wore boots that clumped in the mud and asked permission before entering any house. Ruth watched her closely at first, but slowly warmed to her, sensing something in the woman's eyes. Grief, perhaps. Or the weariness of someone who'd seen too many families like theirs. Melanie examined the ribbon first. It was, indeed, Elsie's. Ruth confirmed it by the small embroidered cross stitched into the corner, a private touch only a mother would recognize. Melanie placed it in a small evidence bag, handling it as if it might crumble in her fingers. Next, she examined the horse. "It came from the east," she told the sheriff after walking the property line. "The hooves are packed with red clay. It's not from this part of the county." Samuel looked up. "East is just woods and hills. Nothing out there." Melanie nodded. "And about 10 miles out, there's a section of state-owned landhold. Logging roads, a few off-grid homesteads, places nobody's checked in years. You think someone kept them out there?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Melanie didn't answer. She simply said, "We need to go see." They formed a small group the next morning, Melanie, Jacob, and 2 local deputies. Ruth wanted to go, but Samuel insisted she stay behind. "If there's something out there," he told her gently, "you'll need to be here if they're brought home." The horse wouldn't move for hours after it returned. But on the 4th morning, Jacob noticed it pacing by the gate, looking toward the woods east of the farm. It kept nudging the fence, snorting softly, restless. "Should we follow it?" he asked. Melanie looked at the horse, then at the trail leading through the fields. "Let's see where it takes us." They let the horse walk ahead, reins dragging, moving at a slow but steady pace. It walked for over 2 hours, cutting across meadows, shallow creeks, finally into the dense trees where old logging roads wound through forgotten timberland. The team followed silently, boots crunching leaves, radios off. Then the horse stopped. They had reached a clearing, small, overgrown, half-shadowed by pine. On the far side stood a rusted trailer, tilted slightly where its back tire had sunk into the earth. The windows were boarded. A faded tarp hung off the side like a wounded wing. Smoke stains curled up one corner. "This isn't on any of our maps," one deputy muttered. Melanie raised a hand. "Stay quiet." Jacob approached slowly. The horse stood still, eyes fixed on the trailer, breathing hard. There was no sign of life. Melanie stepped closer, her hand resting near her holster. "Jacob, open that door." He hesitated, then nodded. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, and the smell hit them first. Stale air, damp wood, something. Sour and old. Inside was a mattress torn and moldy a rusted stove, a small table with a broken oil lamp, and in the corner, something gray and slumped over. It was a coat, an Amish girl's coat, blue, child-size dot. Jacob reached for it with trembling hands. The tag inside read one word: Elsie. Melanie scanned the floor. Scattered papers, empty canning jars, one cracked mirror, but no sign of anyone, no blood, no bones. "It's abandoned," she said. "But someone brought them here." Jacob clutched the coat. No one had an answer. Back at the Yoder farm, Ruth stood on the porch, watching the horizon. She didn't know why, but her hands were trembling again, just like the day they hadn't come home. And deep in the woods, where the trees pressed close, like watchers, something unseen moved quietly behind the next ridge. Observing the last place they'd come, the coat sat on the kitchen table like a ghost. Ruth hadn't said a word since Jacob brought it home. She'd only touched the collar once, fingers trembling, then folded her hands in her lap and stared at it as if it might breathe. "She wore that the last time I saw her," Ruth finally whispered. "I made the cuff shorter that morning." Sat across from her, still muddy from the woods, his face drawn and pale. It was in the trailer. There was no sign of them, just that coat and some old jars. No blood, no bones, nothing. Samuel stood by the window, arms crossed. Then someone's keeping them alive. Ruth didn't reply, but something in her eyes shifted. Not hope exactly, something harder. Later that night, she opened the drawer in the sideboard where she kept a box of old photos. Most were of family birthdays, church days, summers past. But at the very bottom was a single photograph, slipped there years ago, face down. It showed the girls sitting on the buggy, both smiling, the horse's reins coiled loosely in Grace's lap, but behind them, barely visible, was a man, blurred, distant, standing at the far edge of the market crowd. He wore a dark jacket and a hat pulled low. Ruth had never paid attention to him before, but now she noticed his face was turned toward the girls, not the camera. The next morning, Ruth brought the photo to Melanie. The investigator turned it over in her hands, eyes narrowing. "Where did you get this?" "My son Jacob took it the week before they vanished," Ruth said. "He'd just been given a little camera by a neighbor who left the community." Nodded slowly. "And you don't recognize the man?" Ruth hesitated. "No, but I've seen that hat before." Melanie scanned the photo again. "Can I take this with me?" "Yes," Ruth said, "but I want it back." "Back at the sheriff's office." Melanie had the photo scanned and enhanced. The man's face was still mostly in shadow. One feature stood out clearly, a large scar across his right cheek, a faint but unmistakable. The sheriff leaned over her shoulder. "That's not one of ours." Melanie didn't respond. Her mind was already sorting through old cases, names, and sightings. She pulled up a list from a prior missing persons case, a teenage girl from a neighboring county. Gone in 1991. That girl had never been found. But her family had reported seeing a man hanging around the churchyard weeks before. A man with a scar. Meanwhile, back on the Yoder farm, the horse still wouldn't eat much. It drank water and stood close to the barn, but kept facing the east woods, as if expecting something else to return. Jacob slept in the loft above the barn now. He couldn't bear the silence in the house. At night he thought he heard distant hoofbeats. Once he thought he heard a girl's voice, but when he ran outside, the road was empty. On the third night, just past midnight, the horse began to stomp and snort. Jacob sat up instantly, climbed down the ladder, grabbed the old oil lantern, and stepped outside. The animal was pacing again, circling near the fence line, then stopped, head raised. Ears back, Jacob turned to follow its gaze. In the woods beyond the pasture, a small light flickered once, then again like a lantern moving. He didn't think. He grabbed his coat and followed. He ran barefoot across the field, the grass cold and wet with dew. The light disappeared then, reappeared 20 feet deeper. He followed again, ducking branches, scraping his shins on brambles. The wind whispered through the pines. He saw it again, closer this time. But when he reached the spot, there was nothing, just a shallow ditch filled with leaves and an old metal bucket. He stood there, chest heaving. Then he noticed something. Sticking out of the leaves, he knelt and pulled gently. It was a piece of cloth, brown, faded, ripped at the edge. A bonnet tie, bigger than Elsie's. Grace's. Jacob froze. Then he heard the snap of a twig behind him. He spun around. "Hello?" Answer. The woods were still. Then he heard breathing, slow, measured, coming from the trees. Took a step back, holding the cloth like a lifeline. A voice, low, male, and ragged, spoke from the dark. "You shouldn't be out here, boy." Jacob's blood turned to ice. "Who's there?" he shouted. The trees gave no name, just the echo of his own fear. He turned and ran faster than he'd ever run. Clutching the cloth, when he reached the pasture, the horse was still waiting, still watching the trees. He didn't tell Ruth what he'd seen, not at first. But the next morning, when Melanie returned, he handed her the cloth. She studied the fabric. "You found this where?" In the woods behind the East Ridge. Her voice was tight. Was it buried? Just under some leaves? Anyone else see you?
Oh.
Melanie nodded. We'll need to go back. All of us. Ruth stepped into the room. Then I'm coming too. Melanie met her eyes. Are you sure? Ruth didn't blink. They're my girls. That afternoon, they returned to the woods. Ruth, Jacob, Melanie, and the 2 deputies. They found the ditch. They found the cloth. Just 10 yards beyond it, they found the remains of a burned-out shack. Nothing but ash, rusted nails, and blackened timbers. Someone had tried to destroy whatever had been there. Behind it, nailed into a tree, was a wooden cross with 2 names carved into it. Grace and Elsie. Melanie crouched beside it. The wood was freshly cut, the carving fresh. Someone made this in the last week, she said. Whoever they are, they're watching us. Ruth didn't speak. She knelt beside the tree, her fingers tracing her daughter's names. They're still alive, she whispered. I know it. The names carved into the cross haunted Melanie. She had seen memorials like this before, grave sites, decoys, sometimes warnings, but this one felt different. It was too deliberate. Too close to the Yoder's land. Whoever had made it hadn't just wanted the family to grieve. They wanted them to see it and question what it meant. Were Grace and Elsie dead, or was this a message? She took photographs, measurements of the tree bark, even a rubbing of the carved names. I want this tested, she told one of the deputies. The blade that carved it might have left metal residue. Ruth didn't move from the base of the tree for almost an hour. She whispered something the others couldn't hear, half a hymn, half a mother's prayer. When she finally stood, she left behind one of Elsie's old hairpins on the root of the tree, like an offering. That night, back at the sheriff's office, Melanie pulled out her case files. She had spent years working rural disappearances. Some were accidents, some were heartbreak. A few were pure evil, but there were patterns, and one was forming in her mind. She opened a folder from 1985 to Amish sisters missing from Indiana. No trace ever found. Then another from 1989, same age range, same circumstances, just 1 state over. Girls vanished during an errand run, no signs of struggle, no leads. In both cases, a horse was involved, and in both, the horse returned alone. The FBI had touched the cases briefly, but found nothing substantial, just rumors. One agent mentioned a man who infiltrated religious communities, posing as a handyman. Or an outcast, someone who knew how to blend in. He was never caught, never even named. But there had been whispers of a man with a scar on his cheek. Melanie reached for the enhanced photo from Ruth's drawer. She stared at the figure behind Grace and Elsie at the market. Same posture. Same tilt of the hat, the scar barely visible in the shadow. She picked up the phone. I need to speak to Special Agent Darrell, she said. There was a long pause. Then the voice on the other end said, Darrow's retired, but I can get you a number. Took 3 hours to callbacks and a referral. From a contact in Quantico, but she reached him. Melanie Carter, the voice rasped. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. I need your help, she said. It's happening again. There was a pause. Where? Lancaster County. Amish family. The sisters disappeared 6 months ago. Their horse just returned. Another pause. Did he leave a marker? Wooden cross, she said, with their names. A deep sigh followed. He's still playing games, Darrell said. Who is he? We called him the passenger because he always waited for someone to give him a ride into their world. Melanie frowned. You think it's the same guy? I'd bet my life on it. She took a breath. Then I want you here now. Darrell arrived the next day. He was in his late 60s, tall and gaunt, with eyes like pale stone and a limp that told stories of its own. He wore a worn trench coat and carried a leather binder thick with notes. He met Ruth with surprising gentleness. I lost my daughter, he told her, a long time ago. I never found out what happened, but I've spent the rest of my life helping others try. Ruth nodded. Then you'll understand why I can't sleep. Together, Darrell and Melanie went over the findings. Photos, cloth pieces, the horse's injuries, the coat, the trailer, the burned shack. He tapped the photograph of the man with the scar. This is him. He always stays close. Watches. Waits. He doesn't kill quickly. He builds something a false life, makes him call him someone else. Sometimes daddy, sometimes uncle, but never. His real name? Ruth stepped in, so he's still out there. Darryl looked her in the eyes. I'd say he's never left. Meanwhile, Jacob had been busy on his own. He went back to the woods where he'd heard the breathing that night. This time, he came prepared with a flashlight, a knife, and a small tape recorder slipped into his coat pocket. He didn't tell anyone. He just followed instinct. It took an hour to reach the ridge, and there in the silence, he waited. For nearly 40 minutes, nothing happened. Then, a rustle. He crouched behind a log, heart pounding. A figure moved. Through the trees, not a deer, not a hunter, a man, tall, limping slightly, wearing a brown coat. Jacob's hand closed over the recorder. He watched as the man paused by the old ditch, looked around, then bent to pick up something smaller. Piece of cloth. He sniffed it, pocketed it, and walked on. Jacob followed, as slowly as he could. The man walked for almost half a mile, then stopped near a hidden shed, one Jacob had never seen before. The structure was old, hidden beneath drooping pine boughs. There was a door, a small window. The man went inside. Jacob crept closer, and then he heard it. A voice, faint, childlike. A girl's voice, whispering. He clicked on the recorder, the voice said. He said, "We can't leave until Mama comes." Jacob's blood ran cold. He backed away slowly, heart hammering, afraid to breathe too loudly. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he gave the tape. To Melanie and Darryl, they played it 5 times.
Oh.
Each time, the voice grew clearer. Ruth sat in the corner, clutching her shawl. "She's alive," she whispered. "She's still alive." For the first time in 6 months, the Yoders had something more than grief to cling to, a sound, a voice. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to reignite every fire that had burned out. Ruth's resolve. Jacob's anger, even Melanie's. Guarded optimism. "I want that shed found," Melanie said. Darryl nodded. "And I want surveillance. Whoever's using that place may return." Within an hour, they had a plan. Melanie and Darryl returned to the forest with 2 deputies. Jacob insisted on going with them, despite his mother's protests. "I'm not standing on the porch anymore," he said, "not while my sisters might be out there." The woods were damp from the previous night's rain, and the shed wasn't easy to find. Tucked into the base of a ridge and wrapped in thick pine limbs, it looked less like a structure and more like an accident of time and rot. From the outside, it was silent. Melanie crouched low, flashlight ready, weapon drawn. She signaled to the others. Darryl took the opposite side, covering the rear. Jacob stood further back, watching, breathing hard. They breached. The door groaned, hinges half-rusted. Inside, dark, dust-choked air. Wooden shelves collapsed against the walls. A cracked lantern. A rat scurried across a moldy blanket on the floor. And in the corner, something chilling. A handprint. Small, fresh, smeared in dirt on the back wall. Barely visible unless you knew to look. "She was here," Melanie whispered. But that was all. No sleeping bag, no food, no clothes. Whoever had brought her here was gone, and had been for days. "We missed them," Darryl said. Barely. Then he noticed something else. A hole in the far wall. Small, no larger than a shoebox, but lined with cloth, a makeshift cubby. Darryl reached in gently and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to Melanie. It was a drawing, too. Girls holding hands beneath a crooked sun, a black horse beside them. A small boxy figure stood between them, its face a crude frown. Over its head in shaky letters, "He says no one loves us anymore." Melanie swallowed hard. Jacob turned away, fists clenched. That night, she returned to her motel room and didn't sleep. She stared at the drawing on the desk, and underneath it, the notes she and Darryl had built over the past few days. There was a pattern, and now there was a message. It was keeping them isolated. Not trafficked, not escaped, just taken. But why? Why keep 2 young girls alive for months? Why stay near their home? Why risk returning to the woods? Darryl had his theory. He's delusional, he said. He builds fantasies. He wants them to depend on him. He tears them away from everyone they love, then tries to convince them they were abandoned. Melanie nodded. The worst kind of captor. A killer. A father figure. But don't let that fool you, Daryl added. When the fantasy breaks, when they stop playing along, he snaps. Meanwhile, Ruth had begun her own quiet rebellion. She started placing pieces of Grace and Elsie's clothing on the fence line at dusk bonnets, aprons, hair ties. If she's near, she told Jacob, maybe she'll see them. Maybe she'll remember. Neighbors talked. Some said Ruth had lost her grip. Others said they would have done the same. One night, Melanie parked her car across from the Yoder home and watched as Ruth pinned up a faded dress in the moonlight. The wind tugged at the fabric gently like a ghost passing through. Back in the sheriff's office, a map was taking shape. Pins marked the Yoder farm, the market, the horse's return, the burned trailer. And now, the shed a rough circle, too rough to be random. He's nesting, Daryl said. Staying mobile, but contained. He knows this land, knows how to vanish into it. Jacob stared at the map. There's one place missing, he said. Melanie turned. Where? Clearwater Hill. Daryl frowned. What's there? Jacob hesitated. Not much. But there used to be an old mining shaft. My grandfather said it collapsed in the 70s. Nobody's gone up there in years. It's off the main road. Melanie's eyes narrowed. That's inside the radius. Barely, Jacob said. But it's close enough. By morning, they had a team. 2 deputies, Melanie, Daryl, and Jacob. They reached the base of Clearwater Hill by 8 a.m. The forest was denser here. The underbrush thick and knotted. It took 40 minutes to reach the old shaft. As expected. It had collapsed decades ago. But what they didn't expect was the cabin just beyond it camouflaged. Painted to blend into the trees, with no path leading in or out. And it was recent. Inside, canned goods, water bottles, a camping cot, a stack of old newspapers. And in the corner, a metal trash can still faintly warm. Melanie looked inside. Ashes, burnt papers, bits of cloth, something metallic. She reached in with gloved hands and pulled out a zipper pink faded, the tiny metal G etched into the charm. Grace, Jacob said. They all stood still for a moment. Then, a cracked wigs behind the cabin. They drew weapons, circled around, but found nothing, just the forest, alive with sounds. Wind, leaves, a bird's shriek. No man, no voice, no girls. Back at the office, Melanie reviewed the burned remains. Among the cloth was another piece of paper, charred, but partially readable. It was a note, written in pencil, crooked and faint. We miss Mama. He says you forgot. I don't think that's true. It was signed with 2 letters. E+G. Melanie kept the note in a plastic sleeve beside her bed that night. She didn't sleep, just watched it in the motel lamplight, imagining the 2 girls hunched over, writing in secret, while a captor slept nearby. The thought filled her with both dread and resolve. This wasn't cold anymore. This wasn't a missing persons report buried in a file. This was alive, urgent, close, and she wouldn't lose them. The next morning, she and Daryl returned to the Yoder house. Ruth was already outside on the porch, rocking slowly, a cup of tea balanced in her hands. She looked smaller than she had a week ago, worn thinner by hope. Did they write it? She asked without looking up. Melanie nodded, pulling out the plastic sleeve. We believe so. It's recent, not more than a few days old. Ruth stared at the paper. Her hand trembled. I still believe I'm looking. They know, Melanie said gently. And they're leaving you signs. Jacob emerged from the barn, face flushed from hours of work. We found that cabin. Yesterday. There was food inside canned stuff, survival rations. He's not just passing through, he's nesting. Daryl joined them. This kind of behavior is rare and dangerous. Most abductors don't stay this long. But this one, he wants something. Attention? Ruth asked. No, Daryl said. belonging. Melanie glanced at the coat recovered from the trailer weeks ago, still folded neatly in an evidence bag. It was too large for either girl, obviously the man's, but something about it bothered her. "Can we test this again?" she asked the tech. For what? She hesitated. The inside lining, the smell, sweat, DNA, whatever's left. It took 2 days, but the results came back. There was male DNA on the inside collar and a second profile, female, on the sleeve. Melanie's throat tightened. "She wore it," she whispered. "One of the girls wore this. Why? For warmth. Was she cold? Was it given to her or taken from someone else?" Daryl had a darker idea. He may be dressing them, making them live as someone else, someone he lost. Melanie's eyes narrowed. That could be the missing piece. They began re-examining similar cold cases from neighboring counties. One in particular stood out, a girl named Julia McAdams. Vanished in 1982. Her case file included a note mentioning a man with a limp who called himself Eli. The child had referred to him as Daddy. Julia was never found. The most disturbing detail: she'd gone missing on a Thursday while going to the market. Daryl confirmed it. Same psychological pattern. But now he's staying longer, keeping 2. Jacob sat at the edge of the room, tapping his foot restlessly. "So, what do we do now?" Melanie stared at the board filled with maps, photos, scraps. "We closed the circle." They expanded the radius around Clearwater Hill by another 5 miles. It was mostly farmland, with small creeks and abandoned structures scattered in between. They split into 2 teams. Melanie with 1 deputy, Daryl with Jacob and another. They searched for 4 days. On the 5th, they found something, not the girls, not the man, but a small canvas bag tied in a tree. 20 feet above ground, hung like an ornament. Inside the bag, 2 things: a cracked comb and a pair of shoes, both belonging to Grace. The tree was behind an old, collapsing greenhouse on the outskirts of the Becker farm. Long abandoned, its windows shattered, roof half caved in. "This isn't storage," Melanie said. "It's his ritual. He's planting pieces like breadcrumbs." "Phew!" "What end?" Daryl asked. Melanie's voice lowered. "So we keep chasing." That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He walked through the barn, past the quiet livestock, and stood near the field fence line. The wind rustled softly in the corn, which had started to regrow that season. He looked up at the dark horizon and paused. There, across the field, was a flicker of light. Just for a second. Gone. Then again, a flicker. Faint. Like the glow of a flashlight quickly turned off. He ran back, grabbed his boots, and woke Melanie. By the time they reached the field edge, the light had vanished. Ash! But footprints remained in the dirt deep, fresh, leading toward the woods. They followed for over a mile, and then the forest opened to a clearing. In the center stood a single, wooden swing, swaying slightly in the breeze. Beside it, a red ribbon tangled on the swing's channelsy's ribbon. Jacob stepped forward, speechless. There was no one in sight, but the swing moved as if it had just been used. Melanie scanned the area with her flashlight. It was just here. They waited in the dark for over an hour. Nothing. But when they returned the next morning to investigate further, the ribbon was gone. In its place, tied carefully to the swing's chain, was a folded piece of paper. Melanie opened it with gloved hands. It read, "We heard you calling, but he says we can't answer. Not yet." No signature this time, just a single drawing of a barn with a crooked chimney. Ruth saw the sketch and gasped. It collapsed. Years ago, after a lightning strike. "Where is it?" Daryl asked. Ruth pointed. "For miles south of here, it's on McKenna's property. No one's touched it since the fire." Melanie closed her notebook. "Then that's where we go next." The old Wellmore barn looked exactly as Ruth had described, half collapsed. Scorched black on one side from a long-forgotten fire. It leaned awkwardly, like it had one bad leg. A weathered "no trespassing" sign swung crookedly from a rusted nail. Melanie and Daryl approached from the east, while Jacob and 2 deputies circled from the opposite side. They didn't want to spook anyone. If the girls were here, or had been recently, they couldn't afford to give him a head start. Inside the barn was a graveyard of splinters and ash. One half had completely caved in, leaving a wide shaft of sunlight pouring through. The other side, somehow still standing, held signs of recent activity. Jacob was the first to notice it. "Boot prints," he whispered, crouching low. Darrell examined the markings. Fresh, heavy knot, a child's step. "He's been here within the last 24 hours. Then something caught Melanie's eye near the wall. A thin trail of blackened dust. Barely noticeable, leading to a loose board. She pried it open slowly, revealing a hidden crawl space. It was tight. Maybe big enough for a small person to squeeze into. She flicked her flashlight inside. Something glittered faintly. She reached in carefully and pulled out a small music box, old, with delicate floral etching and a tarnished winding key. Melanie turned the crank gently. It played soft, haunting, broken notes of "You Are My Sunshine." Ruth had mentioned that song once. Grace used to hum it while feeding the goats. Lenny stood frozen as the melody trailed off into silence. "She was here," she whispered. "Just..." Then Jacob called out, "Mel, back wall. There's something." She rushed over. Nailed to a beam behind a broken stack of hay bales was a square of cloth, a quilt patch. The colors were faded but unmistakable, Ruth's stitching style, the same type she'd used on the girls' bedding. Tied to it, a short lock of hair, blonde, cleanly cut. Darrell's jaw tightened. He's leaving pieces again, like trophies. "But why here?" Melanie asked. "This place isn't hidden. It's not secure. Why risk coming back?" "Jacob's." The voice was quiet. "Because he wants us to find them, but not all at once." Melanie looked around slowly, like a story. "He's leading us through it his version, on his terms." That night, they gathered everything: the music box, the cloth, the lock of hair. She stayed silent as they laid it out in front of her. She ran her fingers along the quilt piece as though it were breathing. "She made this," Ruth said quietly, "for her doll. She asked me to help her stitch it. Grace was 8. Melanie nodded. "He kept it all these years. He's recreating moments, trapping time." Later, Jacob returned to the barn alone. Something didn't sit right with him. He walked the perimeter again, ran his hand along the outer wall, and noticed something odd. One of the beams was newer, replaced recently. He knocked on it hollow. There was space behind it. He ran back to get Melanie and Darrell. They returned within minutes, tools in hand. Darrell pried the board loose. Behind it, a narrow vertical crawl. Shaft led down into the earth's knot. A room, not a tunnel, something in between. The air that rose from it was cold and damp, laced with mildew. Melanie went first. The space below was no larger than a root cellar, but it had walls hand-built, insulated with newspaper and layers of fabric. There were food wrappers, a child's sock, a broken crayon, and on the far wall, scratched into the wood, "Mama, I'm still here." Melanie knelt slowly. She ran her fingers over the grooves. Then her flashlight caught something else. Initials. Burned faintly into the beam beside the scratch marks. E+G. Fresh, as if someone had made them only days ago. She stood slowly, heart pounding. They were here recently. Darrell's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff's office just got a call," the deputy said. "A woman out by County Line Road spotted a man dragging a child near the fire watch. Tower?" He bolted when she shouted. Melanie's blood froze. "What time?" 15 minutes ago." Jacob didn't wait. He was already in the truck. They raced across gravel and dirt roads, tires spitting dust into the trees. The fire watch tower sat alone at the edge of the old ranger property, surrounded by forest. They reached it in under 10 minutes. The tower was tall, maybe 40 feet. High, with stairs spiraling along the side, metal creaking in the wind. At the base, no sign of anyone, but a shoe lay in the grass. Small blue canvas, worn thin, Elsie's size. They climbed the stairs fast. The top cabin was empty, but a note was pinned to the inside wall with a rusted nail. "Almost done." That was all it said. Melanie stared at it, her pulse thudding. "He knows we're close." Darrell leaned against the railing, scanning the treetops. He's circling us now, staying just one step ahead. Jacob was silent. Then he looked down at the forest floor. Tracks going east. They followed for hours through brush, down a dry creek bed, over a crumbling stone fence. Then, near dusk, they came to another clearing. It's not a cabin, not a trailer, but a church, an old wooden chapel, long abandoned, leaning sideways with a broken steeple. Oh. Ruth had spoken of it once, where we were married, she had said before we moved farms, before the girls were born. Jacob felt a chill in his spine before he even stepped inside. This wasn't just symbolic, it was personal. Whoever had taken Grace and Elsie knew this family. He'd studied them. He was watching. The old chapel stood like a ghost from another. Life, half forgotten, leaning to one side, its paint long faded to a dull gray. The steeple had collapsed inward, leaving only broken beams jutting like ribs into the overcast sky. Melanie stepped forward first, the wooden porch groaning under her weight. She didn't like the stillness. There were no birds here, no wind, just the heavy, watching silence of a place too long abandoned and perhaps recently reawakened. Jacob held back. "This is where my parents renewed their vows once," he murmured. "Mama said it felt holy then. Now it feels anything but." The front doors were slightly ajar. Darrell pushed one open, revealing a long, narrow nave with rows of pews warped by time and moisture. Vines snaked through broken windows. The altar stood crooked, covered in dust. But someone had been here recently. On the third pew, a single, folded sweater graces. Ruth had knitted it last fall, embroidering a tiny flower on the sleeve. It was unmistakable. Melanie stepped carefully, scanning the edges of the room. At the base of the altar lay a wooden box. She opened it slowly. Inside, drawings, dozens of them, all in crayon, pencil, chalk, some crude, some detailed. They showed two girls always hand in hand, sometimes in a field, sometimes in a cage, sometimes with a tall man whose face was always smudged out, as if the artist couldn't bear to draw it clearly. In one drawing, the girls had wings, but they were clipped, pinned down. Melanie felt her chest tighten. "He's giving them paper," she whispered, letting them express what they can't say. Darrell knelt beside her, or controlling it, letting them draw the story he wants to believe. In the far corner of the chapel, Jacob found something else. A nest of blankets, a cracked lantern, an open can of food. Someone had slept here recently. Carved into the wooden floor beside the nest in thin, frantic strokes. "Don't forget. Our names." Melanie photographed everything. She bagged the sweater, the drawings, and marked the floor. Then something stopped her, a noise, faint, a rustle. They all turned, listening. The wind had picked up, hissing through the trees outside. But then, there it was, again a creak, upstairs. The chapel's second floor was a narrow balcony, once used by the choir, running the full length of the nave, now dusty and half-rotted. They moved slowly, weapons drawn, flashlights scanning. The upper level was empty except for a small wooden chair near the middle railing. Tied to the back of the chair, another ribbon, this one blue, Grace's. On the seat, a Bible. Open to the story of Abraham and Isaac, the page underlined, circled. In the margin, a note written in shaky pencil. She had to choose. "So do I." Jacob stared at it. "What the hell does that mean?" Melanie didn't answer because, deep down, she feared she already knew. Back at the Yoder house, Ruth sat with the drawings spread across her dining table. Her fingers hovered over each one as if she could touch her daughters through them. "They're sending me pieces," she said quietly. Pieces of themselves. That night, Ruth sat on the porch, alone, staring into the dark. Her hands trembled slightly, folded in her lap. Then, a sound from the woods' hooves, slow, unsteady. Ooh. She stood. A silhouette emerged first. A horse, staggering toward the gate. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, a figure walked, a man, tall, limping, dragging something wrapped in cloth. Ruth's breath caught in her chest. She moved to call out, but something stopped her. The man didn't approach the house. He stopped at the edge of the field, laid the cloth bundle down, and placed something beside it. He disappeared. Back into the woods. By the time Jacob reached the spot, the man was gone, but the cloth bundle remained. Inside, another drawing. This time, the two girls stood beneath a tree. One held a match, the other a doll. Behind them, fire. Beneath the drawing, scrawled in blocky, uneven letters, "We want to come home, but not like this." Next to the paper, a keeled, rusted, engraved with one word, barn. They turned the key over and over, but there were no markings, no chain, just that single word etched into the metal. Ruth stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered, "I know which barn." Melanie looked up. "Where?" Ruth's eyes filled with something between terror and certainty. "My father's barn, the old one, on the land we gave up after the fire. Is it still standing?" Darrell asked. "Barely," Ruth said. "If he's been watching us, he'd know about it." The next morning, they drove out past the southern creek, through the thicket of brush and fallen fencing, until the remains of the barn came into view, a sagging, skeletal structure swallowed by vines and time. Melanie held up the key. The padlock on the door was rusted, but intact. She turned the key slowly. It clicked. The door creaked open. The inside smelled of wet earth and rot. Dust danced in shafts of morning light. Jacob stepped in first, flashlight, cutting through the gloom. At the far end, past broken beams and old hay, stood a large wooden crate. Beside it, a ladder led down to a cellar new, fresh wood, recently nailed. They approached slowly. Jacob opened the hatch. Cold air spiraled up, and then a sound soft, muffled. Melanie dropped to her knees. "Hello," she called silence. Then a faint voice, a child's. "Mama." Ruth collapsed. Melanie and Darrell descended the ladder, hearts pounding. At the bottom, a narrow space with concrete walls, a mattress, and two small figures huddled together, blinking in the light. Grace and Elsie alive. They were shivering, filthy, their faces pale and gaunt, but they were alive. Melanie dropped to her knees beside them. "You're safe now." But as they hugged her, Elsie whispered something into her ear. He said, "Don't forget." He said, "The story's not finished." Melanie froze, because that meant he was still out there watching, planning. His final act. The cellar was silent now. Melanie sat in the hallway just outside the hospital room, her hands trembling as she reviewed the security footage over and over. The grainy footage from that night showed the man who led the horse to the edge of Ruth's property, then disappeared into the trees. His walk was uneven. He limped heavily on his right side. In that limp, in that frame, something clicked. Jacob entered the waiting area, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Doctor says the girls will be kept for observation overnight." Grace barely spoke, but Elsie said the man made them call him Daddy. Melanie looked up sharply. "Not Papa?" "No, Daddy. And sometimes Uncle Eli." Melanie stood, her heart thudding like thunder in her ears. "Eli." Jacob nodded. "Why?" Melanie grabbed her files and pulled out a faded photo from 1984. Amish wedding, Ruth and Thomas Yoder. In the corner stood a young man, thin, expression tight, arm half extended, as if unsure whether to smile. Eli Miller, Thomas's cousin. He was there at the beginning, and then he disappeared. The next morning, Melanie and Jacob visited Ruth. She sat still at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly, lips trembling. When Melanie placed the photo in front of her, Ruth didn't react at first. Then her eyes welled. "I never wanted to believe it," she whispered. Melanie waited. Ruth finally spoke. Eli was troubled, always quiet, always watching. After Thomas died, he helped with the farm for a few months, but he was possessive, especially around the girls. One day, I found him braiding Grace's hair while she slept. I told him to leave. He vanished that night. Jacob stared. "You never told me this?" "I didn't want to believe he was dangerous. I didn't want you to lose more family." Melanie leaned forward. "We ran his name. There's no current record, but 2 years ago, a man named Elijah Moore bought land under a false LLC name. 20 miles east of here. The tax filing listed the property as a spiritual retreat space. Jacob's jaw clenched. Melanie shook her head. Not yet. They reached the property by noon. No signage, just a long gravel road swallowed by trees. At the end, a one-story wooden house with darkened windows and a metal shed beside it. The area was dead silent, no. Birds, no movement, like everything was holding its breath. They approached the house slowly, weapons drawn. Inside, sparse furniture, canned food, notebooks stacked on a crude desk. The walls were covered with drawings, childish, frantic hand. Photographs of the girls, some clearly taken from a distance. In one, Ruth was at the market. In another, Jacob stood by the fence. He'd been watching them for years. In the center of the room stood a single chair. On it, a tape recorder. Melanie hit play. Crackling voice began. They said I was sick, that I didn't belong. But she saw me, Ruth. She smiled at me when no one else did. So I waited. I waited until she had daughters, until she was alone again. And then I made a family of my own. They were mine too. The voice broke off into heavy breathing, then silence. Jacob turned toward the back door. It creaked open. Prints. In the mud leading into the woods, they followed. The trail twisted deep into the trees. At one point, blood spots marked the leaves fresh, and then they saw him. Eli, or what was left of him. He lay in a clearing, slumped against a tree, a crude knife still in his hand. Blood soaked his shirt, but he was alive, just barely. Melanie knelt beside him. You took them, she said. Eli nodded faintly. They were mine. They weren't, she said, voice steady. They never were. He coughed, eyes darting between them. They called me Daddy, he whispered. Then, his final breath. Back at the hospital, Grace sat by the window, while Ruth braided her hair gently. Elsie clutched a soft rabbit toy Melanie had given her. They were safe, but not whole, not yet. When Ruth asked Grace what had happened, all that time the little girl only said, "He told us if we ever screamed, you'd be punished." She didn't say more. She didn't have to. The scars weren't all visible. Melanie stood quietly in the doorway, watching Ruth hold both girls. Close. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees in the yard. Jacob joined her. He's gone, he asked. Melanie nodded. Yeah, but this doesn't feel over, Jacob said. No, Melanie replied, because people like Eli leave trails not just in the woods, but in the minds of the ones they take. 6 weeks had passed. The house was quiet, again not empty, just quieter. Ruth had put fresh curtains in the girls' room. A new rug lay across the floor, covering the spot where she used to sit and cry every night. The old crib that had once held both girls as infants now sat in the attic, not forgotten, but no longer part of daily life. Grace still didn't like to be alone in any room for too long. She preferred staying close to Ruth, sometimes even holding her apron as she moved through the house. Elsie didn't speak much, but her drawings told stories, simple ones of flowers, birds, home. Sometimes, when the wind picked up through the trees, the girls would both pause, almost in sync, as if remembering a different sound, a darker one. Melanie stopped by one Sunday afternoon. She didn't bring files or notebooks, just a warm pie, and a box of colored pencils for the girls. They sat on the porch in near silence, drinking sweet tea. He lived just 20 miles from here, Ruth said after a long time. All that time, right under our noses? Melanie nodded. That's how people like him work. They hide in plain sight. They make themselves small, forgettable. Ruth looked toward the barn, now boarded up completely. I still wake up at night thinking I hear the horse, she whispered. That same sound on the gravel. Melanie didn't speak. She understood. Some echoes don't fade. Later, Grace handed Melanie a folded paper drawing. This one was different. A house, sunlight, the family together, and 2 trees, one tall, one broken. I drew you too, Grace said softly. Melanie smiled. The broken tree had new leaves growing, slowly, quietly. 3 months later, a small memorial service was held not for the girls, but for those lost in other unsolved disappearances in the county. Melanie stood at the back. She'd seen too many of these, but this one stayed with her because the ending hadn't come with sirens or headlines. It had come on for hooves, the ribbon in the reins, and a quiet message no one saw coming. They went to the market just like every other Thursday, but it took 6 long months, one broken horse, and a mother's quiet faith to finally bring them home.